on evolution. Okay, so what do y'all know about evolution so far? What do y'all know so far? Yes, Nick. Okay, so Charles Darwin is a guy who came up with like a way to explain maybe how it would have happened as a mechanism. That's a great way to say it. Ainsley, what were you going to say?
There were like two important parts, like variation and selection.
Good, and really important parts of it, the variation and then the selection. So organisms were different, and some of those different traits cause them to be selected for the next generation to reproduce and have their genes passed on. Good. What else did y'all learn? Need one more thing. Natural selection was the term that Charles Darwin, came up with, and he had a couple of different parameters for it, right? Okay, so this is a theory, all right? Evolution is a theory. We weren't there, when evolution would have happened, all right? And that's why I'm giving you guys lots and lots of information on evolution, because that's what in most classrooms, all you will talk about is evolution in a public school classroom, because God is not supposed to be mentioned. Whereas in our classroom, we can talk about all the science that there is behind evolution, but then all the drawbacks that there are, like all the gaps in the theory. And then we can also talk about creation and all the science behind creation as well. That oftentimes gets left out. It's really cool just how much science there is in the Bible. So we'll talk about that as well. But this whole time, when I'm talking about evolution, remember that it's a theory. None of these scientists were there. We weren't there, right? Okay, so this is all just evidence and theory, and we're talking about it in this way. Now, when it comes to change over time, that's true. Okay, what do y'all know about the height of people compared to 200 years ago?
It used to be really short.
A lot shorter, right? Okay, so people used to be something like 8 inches shorter, about 200 years ago. So over time, there's been selection for height. Okay, being tall was a desirable trait. Tall people tended to marry with tall people. Okay, so now people are taller. So definitely change over time, like Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, totally makes sense to me. I see it. Okay, but as far as evolution as the origin of man, that's more of a theory. Okay, all right. Do you have a question, Jonathan? Okay. All right, so Charles Darwin, he came up with the theory of natural selection, and you can kind of read along with your notes. There's a lot more words in your notes than what I'm going to say, but it's kind of like reading for you guys to do later, okay? So he came up with natural selection. So what's the basic, like if you could put natural selection in a sentence, then what would you say?
Variation.
Okay, something about variation, something about selection.
Natural selection is
The differentiation, reproduction, something.
Okay, how's it to do with differentiation? Has to do with reproduction. What were you going to say, Tommy?
I was going to say, like, natural selection is where a variation of organisms are selected by organisms.
Okay, so mates have to choose each other, and the variations are what cause the variation in the next generation? Yes, Nick?
Changes in organisms' populations.
Changes in organisms' populations over time. So if we put all that together, then we've got the theory of natural selection. Okay, so the whole idea is that organisms are different. Okay, in a population, with each new generation, there are going to be differences amongst that population. Okay, so in a population, there are differences. There are variations in the traits. Okay, another one of the things that's important that Charles Darwin says is that not all of those individuals can survive and reproduce. Okay, there are too many organisms for them all to survive and reproduce. So that means that the fittest ones, or the ones with the best traits, are going to get to reproduce and pass on their genes. Okay, so something that's really important in Charles Darwin's theory is the idea of reproduction and being able to pass your genes on to the next generation. Okay, so I'm going to put it into a sentence, and you might want to add this to your notes. If I were to put natural selection into one sentence, okay, so it's the idea that organisms in a population have variation in their traits. Organisms in a population have variation in their traits. Organisms in a population have variations in their traits. Some of those variations will make them more able to survive and more desirable to mates. So some of those traits will make them more able to survive and more desirable to mates. Okay? If they're able to survive and desirable to mates, then that means that they get to pass their genes on. Okay? So organisms that are able to survive and reproduce get to pass their genes on to the next generation.
This is the evolution.
So doesn't that mean that the next generation will be more like them?
Wait, so does it start with a mutation?
Okay, so variation starts with mutation, right? So whether you're talking about theory of evolution as the origin of the earth, or whether you're talking about creation, like if you're talking about creation, God created like a man. He created each type of animal, and he most likely only created a couple of them, right? And then all the way like to Noah and the flood, like Noah only took a male and a female of each kind. And so there has to be variation at this point. Does that make sense? And that was because of changes like mutations. But mutations aren't always a bad thing. Normally when we think of mutations, we think of a bad thing.
So did you take one of each kind that was, like God created, or that like that evolved?
Okay, so that's a good question, and that's one of the things that I'll talk about a little bit next week. So he says that he took one of each kind, which leads us to believe that he took like there might have been multiple different species of or not species. Dogs are all in the same species; they're just different breeds. There might have been multiple different types of dogs, but that he chose like the smallest dog and took a male and a female because it was an ark, and they had to be able to fit all these animals on it. And so the theory is that he probably chose babies and probably chose the smaller breeds. Does that make sense? And when he says he took two of each kind, a male and a female, that leads us to believe that he didn't take one of each species. Kind sounds kind of vague, and so it would make you think that more like he took two of each class or two of each order. You know what I mean?
And not like
And not specifically. He probably didn't take like a chimp and an ape, and you get what I'm saying? Like all these different. It's hard to say because we weren't there, but he does say two of each kind, and so that's a little bit vague. But even if you were to believe in the theory of evolution, so believing that we evolved from hydrogen, basically, okay?
where did hydrogen come from?
There you go, right? There's the question. But with that theory, even with that theory, there had to have been mutations over time in order to make all of the organisms so different, in order to have different types of dogs and different types of amphibians and all that. Okay. So there's natural selection in a nutshell, and we're going to do an activity on that later if we have time. So survival of the fittest is a term that goes along with natural selection. So fitness I define in your notes, and I don't know exactly where, but you can probably find it. It's in quotation marks. So fitness is the ability to survive and reproduce. All right? Fitness is the ability to survive and reproduce. So survival of the fittest. What now?
Will you just write all this at the bottom?
Sure, you can add it wherever you want to.
Wait, are we on over, like, where are we?
We're in that first section there that's about natural selection.
Are we supposed to write all of this, the whole slide down?
No, this is all already in your notes.
Or-
Yeah, this is on.
People are adding things that I'm saying verbally. This is how I do notes in AP, so I think y'all will get the hang of it. Okay. All right. So that's what survival of the fittest is. So fitness is the ability to pass on genes and reproduce. So those that are the most fit are those that have the best traits so they can survive, attract mates, and pass their genes on to the next generation. For people, we don't really think, well, kind of. I mean, people like it's an awesome, incredible thing to be able to adopt, but it's also a really cool thing to be able to have your own kids, and that's all about just passing your genes on to the next generation. So people think about that a tiny bit, but we're not as big on that as like other organisms out there. So like, for example, crickets. The only thing that crickets are thinking about is surviving and reproducing, and they want the next generation to get their genes, and so they want to get to reproduce. That and food, right? And so those are the only things that they think about. We have like a lot of other things that we think about, but organisms are designed to think that way. Okay. All right. So descent with modification. This is a term that's also in your notes if you scroll down. So descent makes you think like to move down. So descent, and then modification is like a change. So descent with modification is the idea that with each generation there's going to be a change. Okay? Why do y'all think that there would be a change with each generation? What do y'all think?
Because the changes stinks.
But why?
Because they're gonna be more desirable for adapt more and.
Very good.
Traits like giraffe having long necks instead of short.
Good. So, like, for example, maybe the environment is different with generation 1 than it was with generation 2. So, therefore, the traits that are favorable might change, right? Maybe for a little while, having long legs is favorable for a certain type of bird. But then having short legs becomes favorable with the next generation. And so those genes are going to be the ones that survive. Okay? So the environment changes, and therefore the traits that are favorable change. Okay? So therefore, with each generation, there's going to be changes. What role does genetics and DNA play in this? So we know that DNA codes for everything about us, all of our traits, all of these variations in traits. Okay? So DNA has to do with the traits that are coded for and also the mutations, right? Okay? Again, this is all in your notes. But you can be adding things that I'm saying. If you like the way I say something, then you can kind of type it in there.
Like, what are we under in our notes?
We're not really doing that. You kind of add on things.
You kind of, this is all in your notes, and it's in order, the order of your notes as I'm going. And so you're just reading through your notes as I'm talking and adding in if you hear things that you like that I say.
It's not worth
Writing them all at the bottom.
Or you can add them all at the bottom like Briggs is saying if you want to. Okay? All right. Let's see.
And you're recording all the shows.
And I'm recording it so you can watch it again. All right. So there is a section that's called evidence. Do y'all see that? Evidence for evolution. You see that, Lawton? Scroll on down. Hey, Tommy, I can't get up. Can you help her? Can you help Lawton, please, Tommy? Or Allison?
I will.
Oh, what? What are real evidence?
Evidence for evolution.
Is there?
So there's anatomy evidence.
I just see, with modification.
All I have is overproduction, variation, and adaptation.
It's the first day.
The first day,
Under field of
field of anatomy.
No, field of paleontology. Field of anatomy.
Oh, right here.
Okay, so start with field of anatomy. Sorry, I thought I titled that section. I think I took it out so that it would fit on 2 pages. Okay, so we're on evidence. So I give you a few pieces of evidence there, and I kind of go into more descriptive ways of describing physical anatomy evidence that evolutionists use to support the theory of evolution. Like if I'm an evolutionist, okay, which I'm not, but if I was, then I would talk about these things to say, well, these things are true, and therefore my theory must be right. Okay, so this is evidence for evolution. So one of them is homologous structures. What does homo mean? Same. Okay. So homologous structures. This right here, this whale fin, the frog leg, the horse leg, the lion leg, human arm, bat wing, and bird. Okay. So all of these things they're called homologous structures to each other because what's kind of the same about them?
Very similar.
The bones look really similar, right? Okay, so they each have like an upper arm bone and like 2 forearm bones and carpals and phalanges. So they look pretty similar actually, maybe like a different length and things like that, but similar. So homologous structure, same structure, but do these have the same function as each other?
No.
No. Okay, so homologous structure are structures on different organisms that have the similar or same structure, but different function. For example, like a whale fin obviously has a totally different function than a frog leg, but they have a similar structure on the inside as far as the bones. Yes, Nick? That's not a horseshoe crab. That's a trilopod, and it's a fossil. Okay, good question though. It does look like a horseshoe crab, or like a sand flea. Okay. So this right here, these are homologous structures. So evolutionists would use this example to say, well, this would suggest that we all came from a common ancestor. Okay. Whereas, I mean, a creationist would say, and I'll kind of give you both points of view every time. A creationist would say, well, God's pretty smart and he knew this was a functional way to form the bones. And so he made them all that way. So it's 2 different perspectives. Yes.
Well, kind of we all did come from the same ancestor, not like animals and humans, but like humans all came from the same human.
The same human. Yeah.
And animals all came from like the same.
Yeah.
We all have.
But this is suggesting that like whales, frogs, horses, lions all came from the same, well, that we all came from hydrogen, then the earth formed, then amino acids formed, then amino acids and DNA formed, and then that made like the first prokaryote, and then that arose the first eukaryote, and then that arose all of the organisms that are now.
If that had happened, would there be other planets near us that are like suitable for life?
You mean that like life would have adjusted?
Yeah. Like the big
Yeah.
Bang, those would just like be the same thing.
I mean, that's a great thought, that you would think that life would have adjusted to wherever it was in relation to the sun, but it's a good question. All right, so then we have what are called vestigial organs. So vestigial organs are organs that do not have a function now, but maybe they did at one point. So what types of organs am I talking about?
The pinky toe.
The pinky toe. I think we need our pinky toe. Like, it's not, you don't have to have it, but it's kind of nice.
Like you can't walk if you don't have your big toe.
Your big toe is really big on balance. Okay, Caitlin?
On Grey's Anatomy,
They
when
were
they take one
popular.
off someone's toe and they use it as somebody else's thumb.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
That's not real.
That's cool. Okay, Nick?
Yeah, they cut someone's big toe off.
What now? Did you say wisdom teeth? Shh. Hey guys, Nick had a good one. Okay, he said wisdom teeth. All right, we have our wisdom teeth removed for the most part. Okay, but maybe at one point, the whole theory related to evolution is that maybe at one point our jaws were longer and we needed more for grinding. Okay, also canine teeth. Okay, so what now? We don't have to like rip and tear, so do we really need canine teeth? But the whole idea is that maybe at one point we did. And then, what now?
We only need one.
Yeah, we only really need one. Well, it's nice to have two in case one messes up, right? Okay.
But you can survive.
Or in case you need to donate one to a friend. Okay. All right. Also, like body hair, we don't really need that so much now, but the idea is that maybe at one point it was used to keep people warm. Also, the appendix should be like the first one that comes to your mind. Okay, so that's an organ that is part of the digestive system. It's attached to the colon, but it actually has no known purpose that we know of, except for to rupture and cause people to be sick, and then be removed.
Not everybody with the babies.
Because it's nice to avoid surgery if you can. There are not enough people who have appendix issues to immediately remove it.
I mean, all it does is like store stuff that can kill you at first.
Well, but think about all the infection that could potentially be caused by everyone trying to remove the appendix when they're babies.
You want a little baby, like a baby.
They should get like a pill that they should get a pill in their skull that just like cuts off.
Right here, guys. Okay, what's the next set of evidence I'll talk about after anatomy? Scroll down. Field of paleontology, that's fossils and stuff like that. All right, so here's one example of a fossil. This is a trilobite, and we'll talk about how they date fossils once we get into after the test. Like, it won't be on the test, okay? The fact that fossils are used as evidence to support evolution will be on the test, but how they date them will not be on the test. We'll go over that after the test. It's just more of an extra fun thing, okay? So fossils are one thing that scientists use to support evolution, okay? What's the next section I used? Okay, all right, good. I want to make sure I was on the right track, okay? Also, the fact that amino acids are similar in all organisms is a big thing. So like our proteins are very similar to proteins in other organisms, and we use the same amino acids. Do y'all remember how we made the bugs and we had to figure out what amino acids coded for the traits? So those 20 amino acids that we use, like serine and methionine, thinking back to all that, okay? Those same amino acids are the same amino acids that compose our proteins.
I didn't have a number.
You have to, Tommy. I'm sure you don't have a different document.
Yeah, we like copy and pasted it.
No, I don't have any of those either.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have any diagrams or anything.
All right.
I don't have any of the pictures to show you.
I'm fine.
It's like the first diagram.
Wait, what is this?
The first diagram I have is like a D shape.
Paleontology.
So where's all that stuff?
Yep, notes on your phone.
I choose Darwin.
Awesome. This is gonna be an awesome video.
Oh, yeah, because I have one on my list.
Yeah, say something.
Am I just down?
I can.
It's just because you have different formatting, Tommy.
Treasure, are we talking to the camera right now? Or the?
Y'all, it can't hear you. Okay, I already talked through all of this anyway, so I'm going to skip on to the next thing, okay? So just know what's in your notes. All right, so the next section in your notes, scroll down to where you see phylogenetic trees. Do y'all see that?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Phylogenetic trees. So these are going to be diagrams that show how organisms could have arisen from a common ancestor. All right, so like here at the bottom, this would be like putting all the primates into a tree to kind of connect them. Okay, so we've got a common ancestor, and then we've got all the organisms that could have come from that common primate ancestor. So there's baboons, there's different types of monkeys, there's gibbons, orangutans, apes, chimpanzees, and humans. All right. So the whole idea is that all of those organisms came from the same ancestor, and that ancestor just changed over time, and now there's all these different types of organisms. And the closer the organisms are to each other on a phylogenetic tree, the more similar. Like here, a human is more similar to a chimp than it is to a gibbon. Okay? I'll show you guys a picture. I think Jackson has his hand up first.
Are you trying to prove like the theory of evolution or the theory of like God?
Okay, so this is all evidence behind the theory of evolution. I will next week talk about the theory of creation. Okay. All right. Cladograms are a little bit different. So cladogram is another type of model, and it looks more like a ladder, and it's used to show organisms that have common traits. So if you look at this ladder formation, you can see that here at the bottom is a hagfish, which is a flatworm. It's a very simple type of organism. And as you move up, the organisms get more and more complicated. So the way that these work is, you see where it says jaws here? So everything above jaws has a jaw. Okay, here's lungs. Everything above lungs has a lung. See that the fish got left out there. So the fish, the perch fish, has a jaw, but it doesn't have a lung, so it has to go below lungs. Y'all see that? So all the way up here at the chimp and the mouse, it has all of these things. Okay? All right. Speciation, so that's the origin of a new species from an existing species. So that's the idea that like saying that there was a primate that became lots of different types of primates. All right. So one example would be there. Have y'all heard of the Galapagos Islands?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna scroll through this because we don't really need to be. Okay. We'll get to Hardy Wurmberg in a second. So the Galapagos finches. So the Galapagos are a bunch of different islands, and there are scientists who've been studying these Galapagos finches because there are now 13 different species of Galapagos finches. Okay, what are the parameters for a species? They can reproduce and have fertile offspring. That's important. Okay. All right. So for some reason or another, they started with one type of finch, and now they have 13 different species of finches that won't interbreed with each other. Okay? And the way that happened is that, so the Galapagos has a bunch of different islands, right? Okay? And on each island, because of where it's located on the latitude, there are lots of extreme weather patterns. Okay? Even on one island, there can be extreme weather patterns. And so basically what happened is that these finches flew to different islands and then got isolated there. So these finches grew up on these different islands, and there were different conditions on the different islands. And so what does that mean about what traits are favorable? They're going to be different on the different islands, right? Or in the different areas on each island. And so basically the finches were separated into groups geographically. And so what the traits that were favorable changed. And so that means that whatever area that the particular group of finches was in, it grew to thrive in that environment, and this other group of finches grew to thrive in a different environment. And so they became very different from each other. So different to where they wouldn't mate with each other anymore. It's not that they couldn't, it's that they wouldn't. So the main thing that kept them from mating together after that, first of all, they look slightly different. Like some finches had like bigger beaks. Some finches ended up with curved beaks, and it just depended on what the food source was on their part of the island or which island they were on. But the main thing was their mating behaviors. So some of those species would do a dance, some of them would do a head bob. So there were like several that did head bobs, but they had different head bobs. And so scientists would go there and do experiments, and they would try to get the birds to mate with a different species, and they wouldn't, because they wouldn't recognize the head bob at all based off of the mating behaviors. So they ended up with 13 different species of finches. Okay, so that's examples of speciation. It's where organisms used to mate with each other, and now they don't anymore because they become so different. Okay, all right, so that's the last thing in your notes there, right? Okay.
We use that as like a fact